I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
A good life is not the easy life. It's not being comfortable.
That's Catholic peace activist Father John Deere. In the 1970s, he was inside a chapel up above the Sea of Galilee, where he read the words, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Just then, 3 Israeli jets flew low over the Sea of Galilee and dropped bombs on Lebanon. This experience led him to seek peace alongside the likes of Coretta King, Thich Nhat Hanh, and Desmond Tutu.
In a world of total violence where so many are suffering, dying, to be good, to do the good, means to stop the killing.
Tired, angry even with the violence of this world, John Deere offers up an alternative vision in an interview you do not want to miss. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. When I was a boy attending church 3 times a week in Alabama, I had not the slightest idea that Christian faith and practice might have a great deal to say about war and peace, racism, nuclear weapons, or environmental destruction. Perhaps I missed them, but I do not recollect any sermons against racism, war-making, or wanton destruction of the earth. The preacher appeared too busy getting us to dot all our legalistic I's and cross all our self-righteous T's so God would not send us to hell. But then, years later, I went to seminary, and I learned that even within my own small American Protestant Christian tradition, that our 19th century thought leaders actually had a great deal to say about nonviolence. They called the greedy industrial robber barons to account, and they insisted that racism was a plague upon the church. Later, when I went on to graduate school, in my sojourn as a Southern Protestant among Midwestern Catholics, I discovered yet another rich tradition of social critique and commentary in what is called Catholic social teaching, a tradition punctuated by compelling papal encyclicals. And I began hearing stories about other Catholic priests and activists, whom some would call radical, alternately beloved by some, hated by others, who had given their lives to peacemaking, protesting war, and teaching nonviolence. They burned draft cards during the Vietnam War, they poured out blood in protest, got themselves arrested, were sentenced to jail and prison. One of those of whom I learned stories was a young Catholic priest named John Deere. That's John, D-E-A-R, Deere. Fast forward several decades, and I finally asked if I could visit John. I'm on my way to California, I told him, taping a lot of interviews. Can I come see you? And he said yes. So on a beautiful Tuesday in California, I drove up the spectacular Central Valley, then turned northwest over to the coast to Morro Bay. We met at Dockside's restaurant on Embarcadero Street, right on the waterfront. We got to know one another over lunch, talked about friends we had in common, about the people and books and experiences that had shaped us. He's the only person who has ever excitedly engaged me on a little-known but very significant American peace activist named Aidan Ballou, on whom I had written a chapter in my dissertation. And we discussed how we had both learned that our Christian faith did not mean to us what it had meant to us as children. We paid our bill, walked down on the beach for a bit so he could show me the picturesque gargantuan rock formation in the bay, and then we drove up into the Santa Lucia mountain range to his apartment, tucked away in a beautiful grove off the side of the highway. So, here's John Deere, a priest who has no interest in being nice and offends many of our cultural sensibilities. If you ever thought that all that Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies and turn the other cheek stuff meant lack of courage, then buckle up. Father John Deere, it's a delight to be here with you in your home in the hills above Morro Bay, California.
Well, you're very welcome.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here. You brought me in here a few minutes ago, and it was it's like a living testimony to the American peace movement, with all of the pictures and
I hope it's the Christian peace movement.
The Christian peace movement. Yes, yes, that's a better way to put it, given what you're up to. Indeed.
Yeah, I've had an incredible journey and met the most wonderful people on the planet. And that's why I always tell young people, get involved in working to end war and injustice because they're perks.
Yes.
Which is my fancy word for blessings, which is you get to meet the saints.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. Forget hanging out with the Kardashians. You want to hang out with Mother Teresa and Archbishop Tutu, the saints.
So as you may know, our tagline is exploring what it means to live a good life. And if one looks at your bio, it's arrested 80-something times. So let's just start there. How do you see being in jail and prison that many times as part of a good life?
Well, it's such a provocative question, and I love it. What is a good life? How do you live a good life? How do we live a good life today in this world? But it's been one of the key questions of my whole life since I was in college, when I was a wild college kid at Duke in the 70s. Quite seriously, I was quite obsessed with it. And, I was very politically aware as a kid. My life changed at 9 years old with the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and the Vietnam War. And I went into an existential crisis and was looking for the meaning of life. And by the time I was at Duke in the 70s, the guy who lived in the room next to me went on to be a great man, Dr. Paul Farmer. We used to talk about what are we going to do with our lives? How do you have a good life? And here's what I want to say, because I don't know that anybody's ever asked me that. What prevents you from a good life? Definitely ego, honor, and then greed and selfishness and violence and being part of waging war, destroying the environment. But the flip side is also a problem, which is being nice. And this has always been my issue.
Wait. So just to make sure I heard that right. So on the flip side of all of those things, it seems
doing evil, actively doing evil,
it is also the issue of being nice,
right?
Which is a Southern thing, right?
I think it's certainly an American thing too. I grew up in the South in North Carolina. You know about that. That's the problem. I mean, that's sin. Our problem is our virtue. Now, I'm saying all this because I had a friend named Gordon Zahn who wrote a book in 1960 called, it was the first of its kind, German Catholics and Hitler's War. And he said all the people of Germany who were Christian and Catholic were really nice, good people. And if you care about the world, we have to come to grips with that. They allowed the Nazis to come to power because they didn't do anything and they didn't rock the boat. They went to church and they were nice and quiet. And then they were Nazis. And they were the problem. And you go, oh, John, that's over the top. No, then you look at South Africa. And you have Archbishop Tutu for a friend. And he's telling me these stories about, and I'm reading them, and I remember them. Good white Christians in South Africa going along being very nice under apartheid. They are the problem. Martin Luther King said in the letter from the Birmingham jail, the problem was not the white races. You expect them to be insane. And the problem is not us, black people. We're being killed. The problem is good white church-going liberals. There's nothing worse because they are quite comfortable and they just go, isn't that a shame? I had forgive me for name drop, my other friend, William Sloane Coffin, who was a minister, famous. He said that a lot of us are the bystanders walking by the cross today. I have agonized over that my whole life. I don't want to be a good German. And so then I found Gandhi. Gandhi said in 1926 in the major trial, I think a life-changing teaching. He said, the world has now changed so much. There's so much evil. And here's his actual sentence. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a duty as cooperation with good. He said this in court. We have the transcript. It's no longer okay to say, I'm going to be a good person and lead a good life and do the good, like Plato taught. That's not good enough. You have to also publicly, actively stand up against structured systemic evil. That's changed my life. And I mean, I read that when I was 21. I'm 63 now, and I got with the program. And so to do good means you have to do good, but you also have to publicly speak out, denounce, and take action against systemic, structured evil. And that's why I've gotten arrested and organized demonstrations and traveled to war zones around the world. Then it all makes sense. But if you look at the saints, you look at Gandhi and Dr. King, to the people you've named, I mean, to a blessing to know Archbishop Tutu or Thich Nhat Hanh or Daniel Philip Berrigan, for example. They're not sitting around having a good time, although eventually they were. But their lives were under constant death threat. Those people were some of the funniest people I ever met. Tutu's one of the funniest people I ever met. But he was under death threat since he was 13. And Joan Baez says Martin Luther King is the funniest person she ever met. But you wouldn't think that. But I get it. So my question is, your question, how do you live a good life? A good life is not the easy life. It's not being comfortable, and therefore it's not about making money or being successful. Look at poor Elvis and Michael Jackson. We're not happy campers. But how do you live a good life in a world of 30 wars, 13,000 nuclear weapons, 4 billion people in subhuman poverty, racism, gun violence, child hunger? One could go on, and then catastrophic climate change. So for me, doing the good life is actively working to make the world better.
As you think back to childhood or early 20s, are there other kind of key sources, authors, or experiences that led you to your sense of vocation, not only as a priest, but the kind of priest you've been?
Well, I was very influenced by Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. My father was in the leadership of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., so I grew up politicized. I grew up in that world.
He was the chair of the National Press Club in Washington.
He's in the Board of Governors and was there. I come from an old newspaper family. So I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the most powerful hallways, literally the hallways, and was not impressed. And then I was very impressed with Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And then we killed them. And
And you're how old when they get
9.
When they're killed?
And I then, as I said, for 10 years thought, well, if we kill and crush the greatest 2 people our country's ever produced, what can you do to make the world better? And I gave up hope for making change and decided I'll just be a pious priest. Part of that, since you asked books, Paul Farmer and I used to read in college and talk at 3 a.m. in the middle of the fraternity party about Viktor Frankl's The Meaning of Life.
Wow.
About like, this is the way we were. There would be wild carousing going on. I'm going, but what about Viktor Frankl? And we did an event at Harvard 10 years ago, and he told that story, and I forgot about it. But that's the way we were, and that's how you become Paul Farmer. Well, he's saying the way to a good life is by living a meaningful life. Find meaning in your life. So for me, then the question was whether or not I make a difference, whether or not I can help end war, or I abolished all nuclear weapons. That's never going to happen, right? But if I give my life to be on the side of ending war and nuclear weapons and hunger and racism and the destruction of the creatures, that's a good life. And, you know, I think I mentioned to you, I've been studying all my life the abolitionists.
Yeah.
Those people are nuts. They came along, just little ordinary Quakers saying, oh, we're going to end slavery. And everybody says, you can't do that. And then William Lloyd Garrison gives this big speech saying, we are announcing the abolition of slavery. This is in 1821. And they, you know, he lost his job, his home was burned down. And they said, no, we're going to do that. And I think, to put it mildly, they led good lives. They spent their short time on earth working for something that was impossible, the abolition of slavery. You could talk about the suffragists, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, people in the 70s who were giving their lives for the environment, for the poor, for anti-racism. Those are the saints of our time, and I wanted to be like that. But there was an event. I'll tell you that.
Please.
So just before I entered the Jesuits in 1982 in the seminary to become a pious Catholic priest, my parents were upset about that, asked me to just get a job for a year and not do this. So I worked for the Robert Kennedy family because I was obsessed about Bobby Kennedy. And I got a little money. They only paid me $50 a week. And I've told Mrs. Kennedy she still owes me. And I told her that last month, in fact. I decided I would go and hitchhike through Israel to see where Jesus lived before I became a priest. I thought, that's a good thing to do. I'm 21. I went and told my parents. They were appalled. I hitchhiked through Israel, the Holy Land, for 3 months. And the week I left, summer of 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon. It was the summer war. All the Holy Land tour groups were canceled. The plane on which I flew over was practically empty. I would never do that now, what I did. I was so naive. All I had was a backpack with my Bible. I spent a month walking through Jerusalem, then Bethlehem, then to Nazareth, and my goal was to camp out at the Sea of Galilee. And I get there, and there's nobody there, because 15 miles away is the war. And I'm totally oblivious to this because I'm praying to Jesus and really like Jesus and going, this is so beautiful and this is so nice. I'm having a nice time. And then it was a Wednesday afternoon, July 1982, literally for nobody miles around. Now it's the Sea of Galilee is all built up. But this was 40 years ago, 41 years ago. And there's a chapel on the North Shore. And I went in, and it's overlooking the sea, and there was nobody there. And it said right there on the walls, like graffiti, "Blessed are the poor. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek and the gentle. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those persecuted for working for justice. And love your enemies on the altar." And it floored me, because I was thinking, nice, pious, Christian priest. I'm going to be a nice guy. That doesn't sound very nice. The point is to be persecuted for justice. The Beatitudes are the job description of the Christian. And we've done everything to ignore them. And I walked out on the balcony. Now, mind you, I'm looking out over the whole Sea of Galilee, and there's nobody. I was camping out there illegally for 2 weeks. And when you're on walking pilgrimage, you get crazier than usual. I'm talking to God and the sky. I'm going, are you kidding me? Like, you want me to do these things? Like, isn't that the job of Billy Graham or the Pope? Like, me? That was the breakthrough, that I had to take these teachings personally. This is what the poor guy really wants. And I said, okay, I'll dedicate my life to the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and these teachings. Blessed are the peacemakers, love your enemies, hunger and thirst for justice, on one condition: if you give me a sign. It was brilliant.
And dangerous.
No, the days of signs are over. There are no signs. I found a loophole, as Helen Prejean says. And all of a sudden there were these loud explosions. Boom, boom, boom. I've told this story across the world. As 3 huge black Israeli jets fell from the sky, breaking the sound barrier, setting off sonic booms, swooping down over the Sea of Galilee, right over my head, and dropped bombs on the border of Lebanon. And I went, okay, this is serious. He's serious about it. But, I've spent my whole life thinking about that moment. That's why I'm here meeting with you today. I never intended to do this. But he actually is serious about blessed are the peacemakers, and hunger and thirst for justice, and love your enemies, which means don't kill them, which means you can't wage war, which means you can't build nuclear weapons. But I realize now that the war had been going on every hour. And who cares? I didn't care. I'd seen jets fly over, but Instead of God appearing, I opened my eyes for 1 second to the reality of the world, just in case God appeared walking on the water. And what did I see? The reality of the world, which is mass murder. Sisters and brothers killing sisters and brothers for whatever reason, in the name of God, even at the very place where Jesus said, love your enemies, don't kill them. I saw bombing at the Sea of Galilee. That's why I'm so passionate. Even 41 years later, I'm going to go to my death teaching the Sermon on the Mount, saying, you cannot be a Christian and support war or killing or nuclear weapons. Jesus was totally nonviolent. If you want to be a Christian, you have to be totally nonviolent too.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Catholic peace activist Father John Deere. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode and a PDF of my complete interview notes, including material not found in this episode. And you can also there get a transcript. I've also got some photos of my time with John in Morro Bay on our episode page, along with a number of resource links related to John's work. Coming up, John Deere and I discuss how his desire to be a pious priest dramatically changed after his encounter with those 3 Israeli fighter jets at the Sea of Galilee, and the new shape his life took, leading to being arrested more than 80 times, all of which he says makes for a good life. Stay with us.
I entered the Jesuits a week later, and I was a different person. I was meeting Daniel and Philip Berrigan. I got arrested at the Pentagon. I've been protesting war and organizing demonstrations ever since. And then I went to live in El Salvador at the height of the war and knew the 6 Jesuit priests who were later assassinated.
So this is in the 1980s.
1980s.
Oscar Romero was killed.
He was already dead then, yeah.
In 1980, I think.
I lived there in 1985 and then went back twice a year for 20 years. I was really involved in El Salvador. So after all that, I went back and lived in a war zone. They sent us to work in a refugee camp. So I was with the poorest of the poor, had lost all their families, and we were being bombed. And when the death squads came in, I was 22 with long blonde hair. I was to go out and talk to the death squads, and the thought was they won't kill anybody if I'm there because a white person is there. And that's what happened. I would talk, and when you talk about working through your nonviolence and fear, that was an education in the gospel.
Yeah, I imagine. You brought up talking about working through your fear. How did you begin to learn to deal with fear, move beyond the fear?
Well, I had the most amazing teachers, starting with Daniel Berrigan, because whom I met very quickly. So he and his brother Phil were very famous in the 1960s, were on the cover of Time for being against the Vietnam War. They were the first priests in U.S., perhaps world history, to be publicly against war and get arrested at Catonsville, Maryland for their protests, later for the Plowshares movement, actually hammering on a nuclear weapon, which I then later did with Philip Berrigan, and I myself faced 20 years in prison for that action. But I met Dan. He was a Jesuit priest. I was a young Jesuit in training. He was my mentor and teacher. The other thing was, I know this, I don't mean to sound arrogant, but I'm trying to figure it all out. I was very passionate about Jesus and who is he? And I think Jesus is not who everybody says he is. Jesus, to me, Jesus thinks he's Gandhi. Can I say that on radio?
You just did.
Jesus thinks he's Martin Luther King. Who does he think he is? I'm saying that to be silly, to get you to realize Jesus taught total nonviolence, and then he organized a movement of poor people in Galilee and marched to Jerusalem and does nonviolent civil disobedience in the temple. You do that, you're going to be arrested and tortured and killed in 24 hours. That's a no-brainer. If you did that in apartheid South Africa or Civil War El Salvador, you're killed. And I'm with the Berrigans, Dan was arrested 250 times. And the first night I met Dan, he said, what are you afraid of? And then you know what he said to me? Don't be afraid. Oh,
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Everybody needs a teacher to say to them, you don't have to be afraid. Dan was taught that by Dorothy Day. I was taught that by Daniel Berrigan, and then Tutu, and then Thich Nhat Hanh, and Coretta Scott King, and everybody. They told me that. And then I go and read Jesus, and what's the one thing he says more than anything in the four Gospels? Do not be afraid, do not be afraid, do not be afraid, because they're terrified. They're going to do civil disobedience. He could get killed doing this stuff. You mean offer no violent resistance to one who does evil? We have to non-violently resist someone doing evil? Yeah. And even love him? Yeah. And forgive him? You're crazy. And yet, but he must have been a very charismatic, wonderful person that they would follow him. So if you're not dealing with fears and confronting fear and resisting the culture of violence, I don't see how we're following Jesus. But it's only when you stand up publicly and get out of being just a nice person and being a good person. In fact, most people think you are evil. Dr. King was considered evil. Dan Berrigan was considered evil. Dorothy Day, you couldn't get more evil than she was a communist. Tutu, all our saints. St. Francis of Assisi, the first 5 years of his life, he was stoned every day. We forget that and go, wasn't he a nice guy? You probably would have wanted to stone him because as you would have went on the side of killing Jesus. Why? Because they're saying, in a world of total violence where so many are suffering, dying, to be good, to do the good, means to stop the killing. It's to work for the abolition of war and poverty and racism, nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and therefore to actually engage the teachings of nonviolence of Jesus and work for a more nonviolent world. And that means grassroots movement building from Jesus to Dr. King, building nonviolent movements. That's how change happens. And then the minute you stand up publicly and say, stop bombing Iraq, stop bombing Afghanistan, or you hammer on a nuclear weapon like I did, all hell breaks out. Your family, your friends, church people, they all reject you. I've been kicked out of churches all across the country, and I'm banned from most military bases in the United States. And I feel like, well, maybe I'm following Jesus. He was killed. This is the job description. So then, and only then, does the Gospels make sense. Why is Jesus saying, do not be afraid? Because I'm afraid. So much happens, and the perks. You meet great people, and hello, a meaningful life, a good life. Whether or not I've accomplished anything, I've certainly made no money, and I've done nothing to show for myself, but I feel like I've carried on the legacy of the abolitionists and Gandhi and Dr. King, and I want everybody to do that. It's not worth following any of our politicians. Follow Gandhi and King and Jesus and Dorothy Day, these great people. And don't be afraid. What have you got to lose? You just have to be nonviolent. That's the one catch.
So one question that arises for me is, how does one avoid becoming one of those folks that sees being a troublemaker for the sake of being a troublemaker as opposed to being a, quote, troublemaker for the sake of peace and justice? Does my question make sense?
Maybe. Do you want to give me examples of either of those? Clearly, Dr. King was committed to justice. And peace.
Clearly he was, yes.
But maybe the students against the Vietnam War in the 60s, out in the streets yelling and carrying on, were not in it for the long haul. And they, see, that's the problem. With,
I don't know. I can't speak about
right,
I can't judge them.
Right.
But,
and I'm not judging them either. But one of the problems in the movement is people get out there and get real angry and maybe violent and yelling and screaming, and then they don't see any results and you give up. Or they do it for a while and you get like troublemaking for the sake of troublemaking. I'm talking about much deeper things. So here's a few thoughts. Number one, I am trying to follow Jesus. So this is a spiritual practice. Peace and justice work for me is not a strategy or a tactic or even a task, although it is a mission. It's God's work. I mean, for me, I'm just telling you how I see it. Because if it's not, then I would never stay involved. You give up real easy, and you just give in to anger and bitterness and burnout because you don't make any difference.
Yeah.
You make very little, and it's only the accumulation of millions of lives in the movements that lead to a Martin Luther King or Archbishop Tutu that bring the tide to end segregation or apartheid, for example. And so our job is not to be those figureheads or to bring results, it's just do our part, is to do the good and resist evil and say our prayers. So you have to be a person of prayer. And for a Christian, you study the life of Jesus and you see he's not tolerating injustice or lies. He has no violence. And all his teachings are meticulous nonviolence. So then you really work on your nonviolence. You're nonviolent to yourself, nonviolent to everybody you meet, and you're nonviolent to the creatures and to all of creation. You're trying to be like Gandhi and Martin Luther King as a way to be like all the saints, from St. Francis, St. Clare to then Buddha and Jesus. Total nonviolence, and be part then of the public grassroots movement. But the goal is not trouble. And the one who explains it best is Martin Luther King in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He explains it all. It looks like trouble to the culture, but this is actually the way the healing happens. First of all, the goal for the Christian and for all of us is to proclaim the coming of a new world of peace and justice. We don't need a world of war and nuclear weapons. This is totally resolvable. We don't have to have all this gun violence or this sick racism or anyone starving. We have way more money to feed everybody if we only had the political will and the spiritual will. So we're talking about the reign of God. We're talking about, like the abolitionists, about abolishing slavery, just doing the hard work of building a movement and creating the global political will to end war itself and institute nonviolent conflict resolution programs institutionalized around the world. And then no more nuclear weapons and no more starvation, and a world of genuine equality and dignity. All that's doable. So then you need deep, deep spiritual roots. And if you step out publicly to be part of that, in a world of total violence and war and racism, everyone's going to say you're causing trouble. It's so interesting because Martin Luther King says brilliantly in the letter from the Birmingham jail, I came in to Birmingham, and they're saying, you're dividing us. And he says, you're the most segregated, divided city in the United States, and I'm dividing you.
Yeah.
Well, hello.
Right.
And I come in, and all hell breaks loose. Oh, okay. So, and I'm gentle and nonviolent. You're the ones blowing up every black church, all trying to kill all the black pastors. Seriously, it was total terrorism, white terrorism. And he says this brilliant line. He goes, we are a doctor lancing a boil on the body politic. Isn't that brilliant? And when you lance the boil of segregation and racism, there's going to be a lot of pus. And it's going to be messy. And only when it can come out can the healing begin. So you're going to kill Jesus and kill Dr. King for them stirring up trouble. And that's how the movements begin. And so if people want to live a good life, I think they should drop what they're doing and think of the global good for the whole planet and human race and get with the program to the big issues. That's where the action is, to end war and poverty and racism and nuclear weapons, environmental destruction. And then when trouble happens, when people get mad at you, when your family walks away from you, you get kicked out of your church, you lose your job, now you get to be nonviolent. And then more friends show up. And then you're part of the movement. And then you're beginning to understand what Gandhi and King and Tutu went through. And then, you become a mature human being. This is the journey to be human in an inhuman time.
So I can imagine another objection might be something like, it could take a couple of shapes. So let me.
You don't have to play the devil's advocate.
So wait. Well, I'm just imagining people listening and them asking certain questions, because I'm sure you've heard all of these, right? What about those who have said to you at one extreme, they might just say, "This is outrageous and it's irrelevant what you're doing," and then others might say, "I'm with you on what you want to accomplish, But a better way to accomplish it is through working within the system.
I've heard all of that and a million more every single day of my life. It's such a strange life. So ever since I came back from Galilee when I was 21, I entered the Jesuits. I start saying, we got to weep for peace. Every single day, someone has tried to talk to me about why we need to kill. Huh? I remember leaving Mass once. I had preached against the war in Iraq and New Mexico 20 years ago. And this mother of the kid who was dropping bombs in Iraq said, she's holding her son's baby. Can't we just bomb them all? Is it just collateral damage? I said, but we just had communion, which I thought was pretty funny. Like, what the hell are we doing then? Who do you think you are? No, there's no working within the system. If Jesus worked in the system, I'd do that. He wasn't for reforming the Roman Empire. He's outside the system. He's on the margins. He's a grassroots movement leader. That's why I say he's like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. It's why I never ran for office and why Dr. King never ran for office, even though I was interested in Bobby Kennedy. But I thought those days were over. Once we killed Bobby Kennedy, I saw the Vietnam War. I saw Richard Nixon. And once you have Nixon, then you have Ronald Reagan and George Bush, W. Bush, and killing 1.5 million Iraqis and people in Afghanistan, and Trump, and now blowing up the world in catastrophic climate change. There's a direct lineage. We can go farther back to Hiroshima and World War I and slavery. But the system is totally broken. Dorothy Day said all our problems stem from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system. I knew that as a boy because I grew up in D.C. and saw I was not impressed by anybody except for Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And by the way, we're all going to die someday. I could not find one person in history who has not died. Apparently, every human, this was what I used to talk about with Paul Farmer, we're all going to die, and then we're going to meet Jesus or Buddha or God as infinite universal love, and she's going to say, what did you do with the time on earth? And I thought as a kid, I better get with the program. I don't want to say that I wasted my life making money, especially when it doesn't work. I don't see rich people as happy people. I don't see anybody in the culture. I see very few happy people in this culture. And in fact, as I travel the global south, the real poor of the world, they're much happier because they've been forced to surrender their lives to God in ways we have not yet. So the real question is, you're making no difference. And that's when I say, it's not up to me. All I'm called to do is, I don't have to be effective or have results. That's in God's hands. I'm just called to be faithful to this way of nonviolence from Jesus to Dr. King, and to sow seeds of peace and nonviolence in a world of war, and hope that someday a new generation will rise up and abolish nuclear weapons once and for and war, and institutionalize nonviolence. And nonviolence will be the norm for every major religion in the world, as it should be. That every Christian would be nonviolent, which means the end of greed and violence and guns and racism. I don't know anything else more hopeful to do with one's life.
Going to take a short break. Coming right up, we discuss what John called a functional culture of despair, as well as how to be nonviolent to oneself.
I'm actively not going along with the functional despair of our culture. And it may look crazy, but
what do you mean by that, functional despair?
I'm having a good time is what I'm trying to tell you. And these saints are too. We have a lot more fun. Tutu was a lot of fun to be with. I think everybody's in despair. I mean, the most, let's say, are the people where we had a campaign for 20 years at Los Alamos in New Mexico, where they build all the nuclear weapons. There are more millionaires per capita there, that little town on the mountaintop, than anywhere else on earth. And it's one of the highest cancer rates on earth, and more PhDs per capita than anywhere else on earth. They all build nuclear bombs, 25,000 people, and they're all Catholic and Christian. Everyone goes to church. They love God. They're really nice. And they build nuclear bombs to vaporize people. I think it's the biggest terrorist training camp on the planet. It's hell on earth. And people don't realize it, and they don't even know what's happening to them. Gandhi said, why? On August 6, 1945, the day that we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, he said, well, we've seen the effects, physical effects on the bomb, on the people who were vaporized in Japan. It's too soon to say the spiritual effects upon the people who made the bomb. Well, 75 years later, we're seeing it. I think people in this country have lost faith in a God of universal love and peace. They're losing their spiritual lives. Like as Gandhi said, they're losing their souls. And I see it in this, what I call functional despair, which is you go around, there's no hope. Whether you're rich or very poor, there's nothing you can do. And that's exactly what the culture of violence and war wants us to think. You can make a difference. And if you're like me, look how crazy he is.
So you mentioned a moment ago the practice of being nonviolent to oneself. So would you talk a little bit about what that looks like for you, and also what are other practices, disciplines, resources that have helped you dealing with your own pain in some of these cases you just talked about, of helping you navigate your own understandable anger, if that's arisen in you towards such things? I'm asking generally about kind of the tapestry of your inner life in the work that you've done.
Wow. Thank you. I wrote this book called The Nonviolent Life, and I came up with this theory to try to explain nonviolence in my ordinary words. And what I say is it has 3 simultaneous attributes. You have to do all 3. And I've actually already referred to that. Number 1, you have to be really nonviolent to yourself. At the same time, number 2, you have to be meticulously nonviolent toward every human being, everyone you know, in all your relationships, and then nonviolent to the creatures, and then nonviolent to Mother Earth. And then third, at the same time, see, even that is not enough. That's the question of being nice and good and like a silent Quaker. That's still not it. You have to have third, 1 foot in the global grassroots movement for justice and disarmament and peace. So like the Quakers in England in the 1700s were working to end slavery. They got out of their virtue and became public troublemakers, and they did it. And they did it without having a civil war, by the way. Amazing people. So you're asking me about the first part, and it's taken me a long life. I was raised in a violent home. I know about violence, and I've struggled to be nonviolent all my life. And while I'm teaching it publicly, and then I want to be able to stand up publicly in a demonstration. And when you do that, people are going to come up in our country and spit at you and call you every name in the book. And you got to be ready. If you're not prepared doing your inner work, your inner violence is going to be triggered, and you're going to lash out at a person, which is this is the story of activists around the world. You see violent people on the streets for a just cause. That doesn't help. That's not peacemaking. So it's critical from Jesus to Gandhi that you're working on a nonviolent heart. So how do you do that? So that's why Thich Nhat Hanh taught me this. He had this beautiful phrase, just look deeply within. So you're mean to somebody, or you snap at somebody, you get angry at somebody, or you're just leaving church and you want to run over them in the parking lot. Oh, did I touch a nerve?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
And okay, then you're going to beat yourself up. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. I'm a terrible person. I hate myself. So then it's all the cycle of violence. We're all victims of this horrible culture and world of violence, all of us. Some of us actually from being hurt by our mothers and fathers physically, but certainly all by the culture in our youth, and then maybe through sexism or racism, or just growing up in the Vietnam War or any war. It destroys your spirit, and it normalizes you to violence, as if it's okay to be violent. Or actually, we're just born violent. Baloney. We're born nonviolent, and to be human is to be nonviolent. So you don't beat yourself up. You look in deep within, you go, why did I do that? Well, then you're on the path of becoming a contemplative. And that's where you have to look within and you go, oh, see, violence stays and grows inside us until someday it ripens and comes out. It always comes out. That's what all the teaching is. So you look inside and you go, well, that's because 2 weeks ago somebody put me down and I walked away, but it hurt me. You have to forgive that person in your heart, pray for them, give them to God, and let it go. And once you do that, then you're constantly disarming your heart. And then I learned, as I entered the seminary, the power of what I call meditation. So quiet prayer. I was taught to do 30 to 60 minutes a day. When I was 21, that's my practice. Or Gandhi did 2 hours a day. That's what I'm trying to do now, which is just sit with the God of peace. And the reason we don't want to do that is because all our junk comes up. All this inner chaos and violence is inside us. You sit down in silence and imagine you're with God and you're going, wait, I gotta go. I'm busy. I'm way too busy for this. Sorry, God. Or I hate this person so much. Where did that come from? Or your conservative or liberal politics come up. It's all violence to me. And the God of peace disarms you. And that's what happens in meditation. You are disarmed over time, and your heart is disarmed, and actually you're given a spiritual gift of peace. And then you can step out publicly into the world and be more peaceful and nonviolent. I've seen 25 wars. I've been in court hundreds of times. I've seen a lot of pain, and it makes you angrier. If you want to stay in the struggle, you're going to get even more upset. And Gandhi said, Jesus said all of this. I'm not kidding you. Gandhi explained Jesus saying, don't go with the anger route because it won't sustain you for the long haul. You need something deeper, and that's grief. I've only learned that in the last 10 years. You have to start grieving what we're doing to the poor of the world, what we're doing to Mother Earth. And so here in the U.S., we have to become people who practice grief. Because grief breaks our hearts, and then we can become compassionate, and then we become human and more loving. And then, besides not getting angry, we can cultivate joy. And that's in the Beatitudes too. When they call you names for standing up for justice, rejoice and be glad. Now you're like the prophets of old. Now you're like Martin Luther King. Be joyful. That's what Tutu and I talked about. We have a lot of joy. We get to be like Gandhi and King because everybody's pissed off at us. Just because we're against war.
We've been talking to John Deere at his home here in Morro Bay, California. Activist, author of 35 books. And thank you so much, John, for your time and for welcoming me here to your home and for your good work in the world and all that you've shared with us today. Yeah.
Thank you, Lee.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with John Deere. You can find out more about John and his recent work for nonviolence at beatitudescenter.org, as well as his personal website, johndeere.org. That's johndear.org. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.